Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. And today we're going to be tackling something pretty fundamental to literacy.
Mhm.
We're going back to the 1980s to look at the research that was done on spelling.
Spelling, yeah. I like it. Back to basic.
Exactly. And, it might seem kind of, I don't know, basic or even a little, maybe even a little bit dull at first glance.
Yeah.
But the 80s was actually a really pivotal time for spelling research.
Mm.
You had, things like Uta Fritz's book coming out, and there were huge advancements in cognitive neuroscience, like how we understand the brain.
Yeah.
And all this really fueled a much deeper understanding of what spelling actually is.
Yeah, it's more than just, can you spell a word right or wrong? It gets a lot more complicated than that, like a lot more interesting too.
Totally. And we're gonna really unpack that for you today.
Awesome.
So one of the big things that came out of this research was it started to challenge this idea that spelling is just one single skill. Like you either have it or you don't.
Right, right.
Instead, it started to show that spelling is actually multifaceted. It involves all these different cognitive processes.
Yeah. And it's kind of it's interesting to think about, how important spelling still is in our world, right?
Yeah.
Like if you send an email and it's full of typos, it can really affect how people perceive you.
Totally.
But then on the other hand, we have spell check everywhere now.
Exactly.
So it's like, is spelling even that important anymore?
Right. It's almost like this paradox.
Yeah.
Like it's both important and maybe not so important at the same time.
Right.
And here's another interesting thing. You know how people used to think that good spelling was a sign of high intelligence?
Yeah, for sure.
Well, the research in this era actually showed that the link between spelling ability and IQ is, like, surprisingly weak.
Yeah. That makes you think, like what are we actually valuing when we talk about literacy?
Exactly. And that's kind of what we're going to be exploring today.
Love it.
We've gone through a ton of the key research from the 1980s, and we're going to break down what it tells us about how people learn to spell.
Awesome.
We'll cover stuff like the typical stages kids go through as their spelling develops. We'll look at different teaching methods, both traditional and some more unconventional ones. We're even going to tackle that whole debate about invented spelling.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
It is. And we'll also we'll dig into the relationship between reading and spelling, which might surprise you. We'll talk about whether making spelling mistakes can actually, like, mess with your memory for the correct spelling.
Oh.
And we'll even touch on adult spelling, which often gets overlooked.
Right, right. Okay. Sounds good. So where do you want to start?
Well, I think a good place to begin would be with how spelling ability actually develops in kids, because the research in the 80s really kind of flipped the script on how we view this whole process.
Yeah, okay. Let's talk about that.
So before the 80s, people generally thought that kids just started out not knowing how to spell, and then they gradually learn. Pretty straightforward, really.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And any mistakes they made were just seen as part of this, like, this initial pre-spelling phase.
Right, like they're just figuring it out.
Exactly. But then this new model came along called the developmental model, and it really started to change things. This model said that the errors kids make aren't random. They actually reflect specific stages in how their understanding of spelling is developing.
Oh, so it's more like they're progressing through different levels of understanding.
Exactly. And this is a big deal because it meant that those misspellings could actually give us clues about where a child was at in their spelling journey.
That's really interesting. Like their errors are actually telling us something.
Exactly. And a key figure in this whole shift was a researcher named Gentry. He identified 5 specific stages of spelling development.
5 stages. Okay. Can you walk me through those?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So the first one is called the pre-communicative stage. And this is it's usually seen in preschool kids, like the little ones who are just starting to play around with letters and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
They might recognize some letters, but they don't really get that that letters represent sounds or that we write from left to right. So their writing is often just a jumble of random letters and maybe even numbers.
Right, right. It's more like scribbling than actual writing.
Exactly. And they might use uppercase and lowercase letters all mixed up, without any real system.
Yeah, it's just experimentation, right?
Exactly, just exploring. Then we move on to the semi-phonetic stage. And this usually pops up around first or second grade.
Okay.
And this is where kids start to make those first connections between letters and sounds. They get the whole left to right thing.
Right.
But their spelling attempts are still pretty basic. They might just use one or two letters to represent a whole word,
Like abbreviations almost.
kind of. Like
Yeah.
they might use R for R or U for you,
Okay. Yeah.
or even something like LFT for elephant.
LFT. Wow.
Yeah. They're catching some of the main sounds, but they're missing a lot too.
Right. But they're getting there, right? Like they're starting to understand the concept.
Exactly. They're
Yeah.
making progress. So then we get to the phonetic stage, which is usually around third or fourth grade.
Okay.
And this is where it gets really interesting because kids are now pretty good at matching sounds to letters.
They've cracked the code.
Kind of. They're starting to get prefixes and suffixes, silent vowels, even different verb tenses. But the key thing here is that they're still not necessarily following all the rules of English spelling, which can be pretty tricky and inconsistent sometimes.
Right. So it's more about sounding it out than spelling it conventionally.
Exactly. So their spellings might sound right if you say them out loud, but they might not look right on paper.
Interesting. Okay. So what's next?
Okay, so the next step is the transitional stage. And this is often around fourth to sixth grade.
Gotcha.
And this is when kids start to develop a more sophisticated understanding of spelling patterns and rules. They're picking up on things like when to double consonants or common vowel patterns or how to spell those tricky unstressed syllables.
Right.
They're also starting to rely less on just sounding things out, and they're building a better visual memory for how words look.
Okay, so they're paying more attention to the visual aspects of spelling.
Exactly. And then finally, we reach the correct spelling stage, I guess you could call it.
Like the final level.
Yeah. This is where spellers become truly proficient. They've got a deep knowledge of all those, those complex spelling rules. They can spot misspellings just by looking at them.
Because the word just doesn't look right.
Exactly. They've developed this kind of, this intuitive sense of what a correctly spelled word should look like.
Wow. Okay, so that's a pretty comprehensive progression. But how do you actually figure out which stage a child is at?
Well, Gentry actually came up with this 10-word test that was supposed to help with that.
Yeah.
He used the word monster as an example, and he showed how it might be spelled at each stage.
Oh, okay, like monster spelled phonetically.
Exactly. So something like BTB pay in that first pre-communicative stage,
BTB pay.
then something like MTR in the semi-phonetic stage,
Right.
and then Moster in the phonetic stage,
Yeah.
and then monster in that transitional stage.
Okay, I see. So the spellings get closer and closer to the correct spelling as they move through the stages.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But one of the limitations of this test was that it didn't give very specific criteria for deciding, like which stage a kid was really at.
So it's more of a general guideline than a hard and fast rule.
Right. It was more about recognizing those overall patterns of errors. And that's an important point, I think. It's more about seeing the trends, not about putting kids into rigid boxes.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how did this developmental model actually influence how teachers taught spelling?
Well, it led to some pretty interesting debates. Some people, like Gentry himself, thought that direct spelling instruction wasn't really needed until kids had moved through a lot of those stages.
So they should just kind of like learn naturally through reading and writing.
Exactly. Just let it happen organically. But others, like researchers named Henderson and Templeton, they thought teachers should play a more active role.
Okay.
They thought instruction should be tailored to a child's specific stage.
So kind of like meeting them where they're at.
Exactly. But there was also disagreement about how kids best gained experience with spelling. Henderson and Templeton really emphasized reading.
Right.
But Gentry thought that writing, even with all its invented spellings, was more important.
Okay, interesting. So lots of different opinions about how to apply this developmental model.
Totally. But the research from that time also pointed out that there wasn't a lot of really strong scientific evidence to back up this whole developmental model.
Oh, really? So it was more of a theoretical framework than a proven method?
Yeah, kind of. There were lots of interesting observations and descriptions, but not a ton of rigorous studies comparing it to other teaching methods.
Gotcha. So while it gave us a new way to think about spelling development, there were still a lot of unanswered questions.
Exactly. Okay, so with that in mind, let's shift gears a bit and talk about how spelling was actually taught back in the 80s. What were those traditional methods like?
Well, picture this. It's Monday morning, you walk into class, and there it is, your spelling list for the week. 10 new words, maybe 15.
Oh, yeah. And, you spend the whole week drilling those words, maybe writing them over and over again, using them in sentences.
Right. And then Friday, test day.
Yep. the dreaded spelling test. And even though there was research showing that this whole study test routine wasn't the most effective, especially for kids who struggled with spelling, it was still incredibly common.
Yeah, I remember that from school. It's like, why was that the go-to method?
Well, I think part of it was just because it was so familiar,
Makes sense.
and it was pretty easy to manage in a classroom. But the research did suggest a more effective alternative.
Okay.
It's called the test study procedure. And it's kind of the opposite of what you'd expect.
Oh, how so?
So instead of studying first and then being tested, you actually get tested first, like right at the beginning of the week.
So you see what you don't know right away.
Exactly. And that way, you can focus your studying on the words you actually need to learn.
That's smart. More efficient.
Totally.
Yeah.
But the research also highlighted another big challenge with spelling instruction. Boredom.
Yeah.
Let's face it, memorizing spellings can be pretty dull.
It's not the most exciting thing in the world.
Oh, one researcher even said that teaching spelling might require more gimmickry than any other subject just to keep kids engaged.
Gimmickry.
Yeah, like you got to get creative to make it fun.
Makes sense. So a lot of the research was looking for ways to make it more engaging for students.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's also worth noting that a lot of the research on spelling instruction during this time focused specifically on kids with learning disabilities.
Okay. Why is that?
Well, probably because spelling difficulties are so common in those kids.
Yeah.
And it's easier to see the effects of different teaching methods when you're working with a group that really struggles with spelling.
Right. It's like a more controlled group for the research.
Exactly. Now, there was this underlying question about how important direct spelling instruction even was. Like some teachers, especially in the early grades, they would just skip it altogether.
They just wouldn't teach spelling.
Not formally. They might, correct some misspellings here and there, but they wouldn't do dedicated spelling lessons.
Interesting. Why not?
I think some thought it was just, like, too hard for little kids to memorize all those spellings.
Okay.
But the research suggested that even young kids can benefit from more structured spelling instruction.
So some kind of systematic approach is helpful.
Yeah, definite. But here's the thing. There were also all these inconsistencies in how teachers actually understood effective spelling instruction.
Oh, like they weren't sure what methods worked best.
Right. And even when they did know, they often chose easier, less effective methods just because of, time constraints or because they thought the more effective methods would be too hard for their students.
That's kind of frustrating, Like if there's research showing what works best, why not use it?
Yeah. It's not always that simple in the real world, though.
I guess so.
And then you had this reliance on commercially prepared spelling materials,
Yeah.
like workbooks and stuff.
Right.
And teachers often said these weren't that effective.
So they were using materials they didn't even think were that good.
Yeah. Again, I think it comes down to practicality. Those pre-made materials were just easy to use.
Right. They make life easier for the teacher. But what about the students?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this really fascinating analysis of those popular spelling textbooks from that time.
What did it find?
Well, it basically showed that they were pretty limited. They all used pretty standard sets of common words, but there wasn't much variety in the less frequent words.
Okay.
They often focused on repeating spelling rules, but there weren't enough practice activities to really make those rules stick.
Right.
And they relied way too much on just copying words, which isn't always the best way to learn them.
So not the most effective materials. But what about the way new words were introduced? Did the research say anything about that?
Yes. That's actually where we start to see some promising findings. So there was this idea of distributed practice, which basically means breaking those long weekly word lists into smaller sets and studying them a little bit each day.
Okay, so spreading it out instead of cramming it all at once.
Exactly. And the research showed that this distributed practice was generally more effective, especially for kids who struggle with spelling.
That makes sense. Like giving your brain more time to process the information.
Exactly. But there was a bit of a confound in the research. When you break a list into smaller chunks, the time between when you first study a word and when you're tested on it is naturally shorter.
Right.
So it was hard to tell if the improvement was just because of the smaller study units or because of the more frequent practice sessions.
So both factors might have been at play.
Yeah. But overall, distributed practice seemed to be a good thing.
Okay. What about how much time should be spent on spelling each week? Was there a magic number?
Well, the recommendations were kind of all over the place.
Really?
Yeah. Some said 60 to 75 minutes a week, broken into like 10-minute daily sessions.
Okay.
Others said less than that.
So no clear consensus?
Not really. It seemed to be based more on like anecdotal evidence from teachers than on solid research.
Gotcha. So it's more about finding what works best for the individual student.
Yeah, probably. Now, another interesting concept that came up was spelling level.
Spelling levels.
Yeah. So researchers started talking about the difference between your instructional level, which is basically the level where you can spell about 70% of the words correctly,
Okay.
and your frustration level, which is where you're getting way fewer right.
So, like, if you're only getting half the words right, that's probably too hard for you.
Exactly. And the thinking was that kids at that frustration level might need, like, different teaching methods or even specialized programs to help them catch up.
Right. It's not just about giving them more of the same.
Exactly. Now, another really important finding from the research was about feedback. It turns out that getting immediate feedback on your misspellings is crucial.
Okay, that makes sense. Like, if you don't know you're making a mistake, how can you learn from it?
Exactly. And that whole, that whole traditional thing of waiting a week for the spelling test, that wasn't very helpful.
Right. You've already forgotten what you studied by then.
Totally. The research showed that getting immediate feedback, like having the teacher say the correct spelling and having you write it correctly right away, was really effective.
So correcting the mistake as soon as you make it.
Exactly. And those correct spellings tended to stick, even months later.
That's pretty cool. So feedback is key. But did it matter how the feedback was given?
Yeah, actually, there's this interesting study where the teacher would first imitate the child's incorrect spelling before showing them the correct one.
Like they were saying, I see you spelled it this way, but the correct way is this.
Exactly. And the idea was to, like, make spelling more of a problem-solving activity.
Oh, okay. So it's not just about right and wrong, but about understanding the process of how you got there.
Exactly. And it seemed to work pretty well. But researchers cautioned that, doing this too much could make kids feel like their mistakes were being highlighted all the time, which could be demotivating.
Right. You don't want to make them feel bad about making mistakes.
Totally. Now, here's something really interesting. The effectiveness of immediate feedback didn't seem to apply as well to adults.
Really? Why not?
Well, one study with college students showed that getting immediate feedback on their misspellings didn't really improve their spelling accuracy that much later on.
Huh. So adults learn differently than kids.
It seems like it.
Interesting. Okay, what else did the research look at?
Well, they also looked at sensory learning, like how our different senses play a role in learning to spell.
Okay, like seeing the word, hearing the word.
Exactly. So when researchers asked elementary school kids to guess how to spell new words, they mostly relied on, sounding it out, like a phonetic approach.
Right.
But the visual aspect was important too. Some researchers even said that English is more of a visual language because of all the, inconsistencies in how sounds and letters relate.
So how a word looks is just as important as how it sounds.
Yeah, exactly. And they found that good spellers were really good at using their visual memory for words, whereas kids who struggled with spelling relied too much on just sounding things out.
Gotcha. So being able to visualize the word is key?
Exactly. And one researcher named Hendrickson, he even said that some spelling problems might be because kids can't create clear mental images of how words look.
That's fascinating.
Right. So there were suggestions for,
Yeah.
like, mental image training, getting kids to practice visualizing words.
Okay, like picturing the word in their mind.
Yeah. And one researcher even suggested learning 2 pronunciations for tricky words.
2 pronunciations.
Yeah. Like one for saying the word normally and one that exaggerates certain sounds to help you remember the spelling, like saying bicycle,
Yeah.
to really emphasize that C-si part.
Interesting.
Right. And another researcher named Wong, he found that encouraging students to ask themselves, does this word look right, really helped improve their spelling.
So it's like they're checking their own work by using their visual memory.
Exactly. But when researchers tried to compare visual and auditory training methods directly, the results were kind of mixed.
Oh, so there wasn't a clear winner.
Not really.
Yeah.
Some studies showed that visual training was better, but others didn't find much difference.
Okay.
But there was this really cool study by Sears and Johnson where they compared a bunch of different sensory approaches like visual imagery, auditory training, computer-based learning, and even kinesthetic practice, which is, like tracing letters.
Oh, I remember doing that in school.
Yeah. So what they found was that the auditory training was actually the least effective.
Really? So just hearing the words wasn't enough.
It seemed that way. And they concluded that visual training is probably essential for effective spelling instruction.
That makes sense, given what we talked about earlier, right? Like how important the visual aspect is.
Exactly. And they also thought that It wasn't just about which sense you're using, but whether the learning activity was actively engaging you.
So it's not passive learning, it's active learning.
Exactly. Now, there was this idea of air writing, where you kind of trace the letters in the air. But researchers found that this didn't really transfer to actual handwriting, probably because the movements are so different.
Makes sense.
So while it might feel like you're practicing, it's not really helping your spelling that much.
Gotcha. So all of this research on traditional spelling instruction, what was the main takeaway?
Well, I think it showed that traditional methods, while familiar and easy to use, had their limitations.
Right. So there was room for improvement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where those more innovative approaches come in, which I think we should talk about next.
Yeah, let's dig into those.
Okay, so let's dive into some of those, those more unconventional ideas for teaching spelling that were being explored in the 80s.
Right, because the traditional methods weren't cutting it.
Exactly. So one approach that really stood out was indirect instruction.
Indirect instruction. What's that?
So it's basically where you don't teach spelling directly as a separate subject.
Okay.
The idea is that kids will learn to spell naturally through, through lots of reading and writing.
Oh, so like immersion in language.
Exactly. So with reading, the idea was that by seeing correctly spelled words over and over again, kids would just kind of absorb the spellings.
Okay.
But some researchers argued that, when you're reading for comprehension, you might not be paying close enough attention to the individual words and how they're spelled.
Right, you're focused on the meaning, not the spelling.
Exactly. And there was some research by Ormrod that kind of supports this idea. She looked at learning made-up words, like those pronounceable non-words.
Okay.
And she embedded these non-words in stories. And she found that the kids who were specifically told to pay attention to the spellings of those non-words remembered them better.
Okay, so focusing on the spelling made a difference.
Exactly.
Well, yeah.
But even then, their overall accuracy wasn't that great. And the other thing is, those studies didn't have a control group. So it's hard to know if the kids were actually learning the spellings from the stories or if they would have learned them just as well if they had been taught them directly.
Right. The stories might not have been the key factor.
Exactly. Now, on the writing side, there's the whole invented spelling approach, which was a huge topic of debate in the 80s.
Oh, yeah, invented spelling. I've heard of that. It's where kids just kind of spell words however they think they should be spelled, right?
Exactly. And the big idea is that, you don't correct those misspellings.
You just let them spell it wrong.
Well, it's not so much about letting them spell it wrong as it is about not making spelling accuracy the main focus.
Okay.
It's about encouraging kids to write freely without getting bogged down in the mechanics of spelling.
Right, right.
And this whole idea came out of that developmental model we talked about earlier.
Yeah, with the stages.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Gentry was a big proponent of invented spelling. He thought that, emphasizing correct spelling too early could actually hinder kids' writing development.
So it's like don't sweat the small stuff.
Yeah, kind of. He thought that, kids should be free to experiment with spelling and that their mistakes were actually a sign of their developing understanding of how sounds and letters work.
Okay, so he saw those misspellings as a positive thing.
Exactly. He even said that teachers should celebrate those invented spellings.
Wow. Okay, so in a classroom using invented spelling, what would that actually look like?
Well, there'd be lots of writing, of course.
Right.
And teachers would focus mainly on the content of the writing, not the spelling.
Okay.
And they wouldn't correct those misspellings directly.
So how would the kids ever learn the correct spellings?
Well, the idea was that they would pick it up through other means, like, through reading or through seeing the teacher's edited versions of their writing.
Okay.
Sometimes teachers would, they'd create little class publications with the kids' stories, and they'd have both the original version with the invented spellings and the edited version with the correct spellings.
Oh, that's cool. So the kids could see the difference.
Exactly. And teachers would also answer questions about spelling if a kid specifically asked for help.
Okay.
But they wouldn't just jump in and correct everything.
Right. It's more about letting the kids take the lead.
Exactly. And what about those kids who were, really hesitant to just invent spellings?
Like the ones who wanted to know the right way to spell everything.
Yeah. The advice was to just, gently ignore those requests for direct help.
Really?
Yeah. The idea was that if they saw other kids getting praised for their invented spellings, they'd eventually feel more comfortable trying it themselves.
Okay, so it's about creating a supportive environment where it's okay to make mistakes.
Exactly. And there were also, group activities where kids would work together to decide how to spell a word.
Oh, that's cool. Like a collaborative effort.
Yeah, and they might even, write their spelling on the board and have the class vote on the best one.
Wow. Okay, so that sounds pretty fun and engaging. But did it actually work? Did invented spelling actually improve kids' spelling?
Well, that's where things get a little tricky. There wasn't a lot of solid research to back it up.
Really? So all this enthusiasm for invented spelling, and there wasn't much evidence.
Yeah, it was mostly anecdotal reports from teachers and things like that.
Okay.
There were a few studies, but they had some flaws.
Like what?
Well, in one study, the kids got to choose the words they spelled, which obviously isn't very realistic.
Great.
And they were older kids, so they were already in those later stages of spelling development.
Okay.
So it's hard to say if invented spelling would have the same effect on younger kids.
Right. And there were also all those claims about invented spelling having a positive impact on kids' attitudes towards writing, right?
Yeah, but those were mostly based on teachers' observations, not on, actual data.
Okay, so not very scientific.
Exactly. And there were also some pretty strong objections to invented spelling.
What were those?
Well, some people worried that, if you're not correcting misspellings, kids won't learn that spelling accuracy is important.
Right.
But the counter-argument was that, spelling develops naturally, and pushing for perfect accuracy too early might actually backfire.
Okay.
And they also said that kids understand that those invented spellings are just temporary.
Like a stepping stone to correct spelling.
Exactly. Another concern was that kids might be wasting their time trying to write those incorrect spellings, and they might even learn those incorrect versions.
Oh, so it could actually make their spelling worse.
That was the worry. But the counter-argument was that, by reading the teacher's edited versions of their writing, kids would still be exposed to the correct spellings.
Okay, so that would kind of balance it out.
Exactly. And some people even thought that invented spelling actually helped shift the focus away from just spelling accuracy and more towards the process of writing and expressing ideas.
So it's about the content, not the mechanics.
Exactly. But there was this, this logical inconsistency that some people pointed out.
Okay.
If kids are going to learn to spell correctly on their own eventually, then why do they need formal spelling instruction later on?
Right. It doesn't quite add up.
Exactly. And there are also practical concerns, like, teachers having enough time to edit all that writing, or parents not being happy with their kids' misspellings.
Right.
And some teachers were just, really hesitant to use a method that they thought might actually hurt their kids' spelling.
Okay. So invented spelling was definitely a controversial topic.
Now, all of this talk about how kids learn to spell, it really brings us to the question of the relationship between spelling and reading.
Right, because those two are often seen as going hand in hand.
Exactly. And for a long time, spelling was kind of seen as secondary to reading.
Okay.
Like it was just a tool to help with reading problems or to reinforce reading skills.
Right.
But the research in the 80s started to suggest that reading and spelling might actually be based on separate systems in the brain.